I'm James Lee. I'm a lecturer at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. And today we're going to have a session in which it's really every lecturer's dream, the ability to talk about a wonderful piece of music with three absolutely outstanding musicians, Lesley, David, and Alice. And we're going to be looking at Mozart's string trio, K563, which he actually called a Divertimento. This is hopefully going to be not a monologue, but a nice dialogue. Lesley and I have yet to be on a stage or any kind of discussion without somewhat arguing. She'll deny that, but it certainly feels at times as if we're at cross purposes. So hopefully it will be entertaining from that standpoint. We can only hope. Mozart, returning to more important matters, Mozart composed this work in 1788, entering it into his thematic catalog on the 27th of September of that year. The thematic catalog is the musical diary that Mozart began to keep in 1784, in which he writes the dates of completion of his works, the instrumentation, sometimes the names of the performers of the first performances, and then a little bit of the music. You can actually see this document at the British Library. The piece that we're going to hear today was not published in Mozart's lifetime, but in 1792, the year after Mozart's death. For a little context, in the summer of 1788, Mozart wrote not only this work, but also in about 6 weeks, his last three and greatest symphonies. The entries for these in the book are June, July, and August. At this extraordinary period of creativity, Mozart confessed to having black thoughts, to being depressed. One reason was that his infant daughter, Teresa, died at the age of 6 months from intestinal problems on the 29th of June. In fact, 4 of Mozart's 6 children did not survive infancy. Throughout his life, he got to know really only his son Karl, who lived a long life well into the 19th century, working as a tax official. His last son, Franz Xaver Wolfgang Amadeus, also survived, but Mozart really didn't know him. Franz was only 4 months when Mozart himself died, and Franz did become a musician. At the same time, Mozart was acquiring quite a lot of debt during this summer, and he wrote many times to his fellow mason, Michael Puchberg, a businessman in textiles and a friend, asking for loans. And over this period, Mozart requested about 4,000 florins from Puchberg in loans, which was a substantial amount of money. It's difficult to be precise about how much money exactly it was in today's terms, but let's say at his height, Mozart earned a really decent sum of 4,000 florins a year, so maybe 40 or 50,000 pounds. Puchberg did not loan him the entire amount, but only about 1,400 florins. Mozart only was able to pay back about 500 before his death. This relationship with Puchberg is significant because the one reference Mozart makes to the piece we're going to discuss is when he writes to his wife Constanza about a performance he gave in Dresden of that trio I wrote for Puchberg. However, there's no evidence that Puchberg commissioned Mozart to write the work, no evidence that Mozart wrote it for a particular occasion or with a particular group of performers in mind. It's been suggested he may have written it in return for being given a loan, but again, nothing in the record corroborates this. One reason for this is that Mozart's father died the previous year, and with his death, the main source of information about Mozart dries up for us. Mozart wasn't writing letters to his dad anymore, and so the record of his life becomes sketchier. So why did he write this piece? The Mozart scholar Christoph Wolff speculates that Mozart's increased interest in writing chamber music relates directly to his appointment by the Emperor Joseph II at the end of 1787 as the imperial and royal composer. This position came with a salary of 800 florins and no real administrative duties. It's really a dream. It was Mozart's dream. Mozart was expected to supply some music for various state occasions, but mostly he was the composer in residence for the emperor's chamber players, of whom there were 12, including the great clarinetist Anton Stadler. However, the emperor was away from Vienna for most of the time that Mozart held the appointment, at war with the Ottoman Empire, and in fact there wasn't a single chamber concert between Mozart's getting the job and the emperor's death in 1790. But Wolff thinks that Mozart was writing many chamber pieces, not just this one, but many quintets, quartets, piano trios, in anticipation of performances associated with the job when the emperor returned from the war. In any case, Mozart was extremely pleased to have the appointment. He immediately published a couple of piano sonatas and had printed on the title page Imperial and Royal Composer, which was not at all typical for others who had held similar posts. Mozart was unusually pleased to have the appointment, the only real such appointment he had in his entire career. It does seem that actually having that standard wage that he could rely on sort of encouraged him to take on more debt. He was convinced that things were getting better and that this was going to be a time of plenty. And so he rather invited more pressure on himself by using that base of income to get a bigger flat and to engage in many more projects that required expenditure. So turning to the piece itself, it's quite unusual. Mozart seems more or less to have invented the genre of the string trio in all but name. And this is not the very first string trio, but it's certainly the first of such scope. One thing that's unusual is the not writing for string quartet, and it seems almost to have been a deliberate artistic challenge. When you take away the second violin, you obviously limit the harmonic possibilities. Mozart doesn't attempt to compensate for this limitation by writing lots of double-stopping passages. Instead, he writes 3 highly independent lines, all virtuosic, all equals, so that the richness of the contrapuntal variety more than makes up for the loss of the second violin. This may be the greatest piece of chamber music that you haven't heard of. It's hard to think of too many pieces of its stature that aren't as widely known. Mozart's biographer Hermann Aber says that it's unsurpassed, not just as a string trio, but as a piece of chamber music full stop. Part of the reason that it may not be as well known is down to the trio format itself, which has never been as popular as the quartet. But part of it is almost certainly down to the name Divertimento, which seems to advertise something rather different to what's actually inside the 10. Divertimento meant several things at the time Mozart used the title, but for several years before, it had settled down to mean an entertainment, oftentimes an outdoor entertainment, something pleasing, something not really too taxing, certainly not polyphonic, and not very deep. Mozart himself wrote about 30 divertimenti. Frequently, these are, like today's piece, in 6 movements, such as the F major one in which 2 horns join the string group. This piece is certainly pleasing as the others and certainly entertaining, but apart from the number of movements and the format of the movements, it, along with most of the other divertimenti, have little in common with the piece we're going to be exploring today. But perhaps Mozart named this piece Divertimento simply because it was in 6 movements, and simply, therefore, it had the shape of a divertimento. It's not, however, a divertimento in scope or ambition. Charles Rosen writes that no other composer of the 18th and 19th centuries ever understood the demands of writing for 3 voices as Mozart did, except for J.S. Bach. As a string trio, he goes on, this one of Mozart's stands alone, far above all other works in that form. It's also an interesting precursor of the last quartets of Beethoven, in its transference of the divertimento form with 2 dance movements and 2 slow movements into the realm of serious chamber music. As for Bach, Christoph Wolff thinks that early on in his life in Vienna, Mozart fell into a group of friends who had all either known Bach or were friends of Bach's sons, and had a wealth of Bach's music in their music in their libraries. So if there's any trend in Mozart's music across the 1780s, it might be reflected in his deep study of the earlier composer, almost carrying on a project to marry Bach's contrapuntal mastery to Mozart's burgeoning classical style. The trio perhaps represents the apotheosis of this study, a perfectly proportioned classical work that is thoroughly contrapuntal. As for the comparisons to Beethoven's late quartets, it may be a step too far, but it's certainly an indication of the size and ambition of the Divertimento in E-flat. So before we go any further with me rambling on, let's go ahead and turn to the piece now. And what I'd like to do to begin with is actually give a brief overview of the entire piece by playing the first bit of each of the movements. So just giving you a taste of where we're going. So first of all, the first movement, Allegro. And so immediately we start off with this wonderful dialogue. The second movement in A flat is a very emotional, we'll get to this movement, really quite profound adagio. And exploring completely a different mood, a boisterous minuet. Which is contrasted with a similarly vigorous trio. And then we turn to a really intriguing movement, an andante, which is a folk-type tune. That's the basis for a set of rather wonderful variations. Then we have our second minuet, which is really, Aber actually calls this hedonistic, which again may be a little exaggerated, but nevertheless, it's boisterous, it's fun, and extremely tuneful. And this is contrasted with the first of two trios. And then finally, a second trio. And then we turn to the grand finale of a sonata rondo, one of Mozart's most ambitious and large-scale exercises in this form. Now, before diving into any movement in particular, I want to look at some of the ways that Mozart unifies the piece. This is not a 19th century piece where we treat themes like characters and sort of follow them from one movement to the next. That's not really in this style. But there are certain motifs and certain ideas that Mozart explores in different ways in each movement, but that are nonetheless related. And these start from the very first thing we hear in the first movement, which is a descending chord, a descending E flat major chord in octaves. It's very simple, moving through the notes of the major tonic chord. This is inverted, turned upside down in the cello in the second movement, whose theme goes through its tonic, A flat major, from bottom to top. And then in the third movement, in the minuet, we get a sort of excitable version of the first movement, descending through the chord 3 times in succession. There are other things that are related. The fourth movement and the sixth movement are similar in terms of their opening theme. In the fourth movement, the folk variations, notice in the violin's tune that we have repeated B flats, in this case the home note, the tonic, descending through a fourth to outline the tonic chord. And then in the last movement, the main theme also has repeated B flats, descending through the fourth, but this time going on down to the fifth, outlining its tonic, E flat. So those are some of the Motivic things that Mozart does, and we'll see some others as we're progressing through. Another way he unifies the piece is through voicing, through the range explored. And there are several remarkable passages in the piece, not least because of the extremes of range that are explored. I want to give a couple of examples and then bring everybody else in to talk about this, because an experience of playing this piece is very much centered on the unusualness of the writing in this regard, would you say? Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we'll look at a couple of these and then pass it over to you. First of all, in the first movement, the second theme in B flat major is a cello and violin duet with a viola pedal. And it's rather glorious to hear the viola sneaking under the cello there and having that more expressive quality brought out in that partnership. In the last movement, the second theme, again, is quite windy here, which is not making the fast page turns any easier. But nevertheless, in the last movement, when we reach the second theme again, also in B flat major, we again have a cello and violin duet exploring the same pitches. And it's interesting to note, whenever these themes come back, Mozart rewrites them. Sometimes the duet itself is changed, the partners, and certainly the pitch range is changed. So all of them have a slightly different expressive quality. As I said before, the range of all the instruments, each instrument on its own is quite extraordinary and quite carefully planned. In the first movement, we'll see that the note C-sharp D flat is quite an important note, a chromatic note that causes quite a lot of problems. And interestingly, the lowest pitch that Mozart gives to the cello is a C-sharp, which is played at 2 prominent moments. The first at the beginning of the development, with this sort of uncanny move to D, which he repeats later on. The interesting thing there is that in all the other movements, Mozart actually takes the cello down 1 pitch lower, so avoiding it in the first movement is very much part of the special quality of that movement. In the second movement, the range is even greater, and this is the greatest of any of the pieces. Each player has a really virtuosic turn figure that rises through 3 octaves. We first hear this explored in the violin. And then we get it as well in the cello, and notice that the cello rises to that same pitch, D flat. And David gets a go as well, but I'm actually going to spare you. That's more of a typographical problem. I can't remember the bar numbers where that happens. So you're off the hook. And then at the very end of the movement, this really special moment when the highest pitch in the entire 45-minute piece.
Oh, sorry.
It's an A flat, which Lesley will. But throughout, and you'll have to notice this when you're listening to the entire work, you'll notice that the players are often quite distant in their spacing. It really is stretching the bounds. There's not as much close writing as you might expect. It's the kind of thing that's talked about quite a bit with later Beethoven in lots of his works, but is sometimes not talked about so much in Mozart. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about the quality of playing this music.
Well, it's certainly not like any other piece of Mozart chamber music. I mean, obviously the quartets are much more closer in their writing, in terms of the part writing. And actually so much of the time, my part is much higher than, well, both parts quite often. I mean, for example, in the beginning of the last movement, but sort of throughout there are these places where I'm really high and they're quite low. The spacing is he's using the entire tessitura of all the instruments.
Yes. And I suppose that gives us one thing that happens throughout the piece is that we all play different roles a lot. Like we're swapping parts and playing. Like you heard, I play the bass line and then I get the tune. And I guess having such a big range means that, like, when I get the tune, which can't be as high as Lesley, I can't do that on viola. It's in a different range from you, so it sounds even more different. You know what I mean? So it's given us kind of a bigger scale of pitch to play with, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think he uses it structurally as well. I mean, in the first movement, for example, that beautiful second theme that we just played is much closer somehow when it comes back in the recapitulation, and yet the end of the recapitulation, he absolutely uses the highest. He could have written it here, but he doesn't.
Yeah.
So rather than resolving to something a bit lower, he really goes.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we can go a little bit off-piste if you want, but in the last movement as well, he could actually rewrite the tune that you just played.
Yeah.
At a lower pitch, but actually he goes for the highest possible version of that.
Yeah.
And we may not actually get there later, but notice that when you're listening. You said the other day, Alice, that none of your parts look like normal parts.
No, I would say that's true, and certainly in terms of chamber music for a cellist, quartets, a lot of the time you have the wonderful role of playing the bass line and feeling like you're guiding things, and of course that happens in here as well, but there's a real there's a freedom about this writing that I think other composers took on in their writing for string trio, but it certainly, I think, frees up the viola and cello to be, as you say, more contrapuntal, and so it feels really different. And also the range you're talking about, Mozart really incredibly uses the vocal range of the cello, really going from a bass instrument to the soprano line. It's fantastic to play it. It makes me long for some hidden Mozart that was written, you know, a Mozart sonata for the cello or something. Why didn't he do it?
Well, and I mean, every evidence is that with this all this chamber music he was writing at the time, we have suffered a really, really, really great loss. I mean, if you look at the, it's a really banal thing to say, but I mean, if you look at the thematic catalogue that he started in 1784, it's something like a 60-page book, and he writes at the beginning 1784 dash. And he puts a 1 there because he thinks he might be filling this book into the 1800s, right? He's anticipating. He doesn't want to write down 17-something because he's not sure how long it's going to take him. And he only fills up about half of it, and all the pages are there for the rest of the book. So, and all of this writing is extraordinary. It is Mozart reaching a creative peak. And all the pieces around this time seem to be exploring that. So there's every reason to believe that music was going to happen. Other things that he does to unify, these are a little bit more harmonically related as opposed to the range of the instruments. I guess the other thing that should be said in this conversation before we move on is that it's extraordinarily virtuosic. This is really virtuosic classical music for every player. The range is extraordinary. The writing is extraordinarily detailed. The rhythms are interesting. The phrasing is unusual. We won't have time to really discuss all the different aspects of phrasing. But I think you were saying, Lesley, that it really seems like a dialogue. And even when the harmonic language seems simple, the phrasing is sort of non-standard.
Yeah, it defeats expectation. I mean, even straight away at the beginning.
Right.
I mean, it's very simple harmonically, but you're left with this phrase that you think might be going to be a 4-bar phrase, but which conventionally it might have been. But it isn't, and it carries on.
It carries on. It frequently carries on, and sometimes they cut off before you expect them to carry on. And frequently, if for instance, if David is playing something that seems accompanimental, suddenly there'll be a little echo. As there is a conversation. It's one person says something, and then suddenly there's a little.
It's kind of more like real life, really.
Yes.
I mean, the unexpected happens.
Also like opera.
Yes, it is very much.
It really feels very much like we're characters in the opera, maybe, interjecting at a time that...
Absolutely, and that can make it, on first listen, not sometimes so easy. Because the music is so variable. It is sometimes so unpredictable. And then he will lull you with passages which seem more predictable, and you switch off for a second and think you're just kind of easing along, and then realize you don't quite know where you are. Which is one reason we're doing this. So one other thing he does to unify is this business about voicing. Right at the very beginning, he explores different parts of the chord. So if you're playing an E-flat major chord, you've got 3 notes, an E-flat, a G, and a B-flat. Obviously, the most important one is the E-flat. The next one, the next most important is the dominant note, the B-flat. And then, of course, we have in the middle, the G. So when we put them all together... Lovely. But that G is a little bit unstable because it might be... yes, so it could easily go minor. And so even though it's perhaps not as important to establishing the key, it is the most important to establishing the mood. And throughout the entire piece, Mozart explores that little frisson between the F-sharp G-flat and the G, right from the very beginning. What you want to notice in the very first phrase that Lesley will play is that after she explores the tonic chord going from E-flat down to E-flat, it then rises back up to B-flat, the dominant, before settling a 6-bar phrase for the opening phrase on this G, on the 3rd note, which gives it a kind of soft, a spoken quality. Yeah. Sort of openness there at the end of that phrase, which is taken up by the other instruments in the next phrase. And this one again settles on the G. David will end with an F-sharp G embellishment at the end.
This is from bar 6. Yeah.
And then continuing to make an issue of this F-sharp G, the viola and the violin then engage in a dialogue in which the dominant chord, the B-flat chord, and its 3rd, which is D, are answered by the G twice. I said that Mozart doesn't go on like a 19th century composer creating a narrative around themes, but he does bring back these kinds of ideas. And we get this rather reluctance to let go of the piece at the very end of the last movement, when, really for the first time in the piece, we return to this F-sharp G moment. There are a couple of other important moments along the way, but not for a long time, and we get it at the very end of the violin, but this time the G quickly moves on down to the E-flat, and so we settle on the tonic. So what was initially used to launch the conversation now becomes a sort of reluctance to let it go, a sort of wistfulness for what's past and not quite ready to let the mood and the movement end. So if we could hear the entire group playing the ending. Great. I mean, once you do know this piece, it's one of those wonderful pieces where all these different melodies immediately conjure up an entire world. It has that quality where one bit speaks for the entire work. I want now to, rather than taking the movements in order, I want to turn to what for me I think is the heart of the piece. I don't know how you feel about it, but this variation movement. I guess the argument might be that the adagio could be the heart as well. They're sort of competing, in different ways. But
maybe the adagio is the soul and this is the heart.
Maybe.
Wow.
Very nice.
Indeed. But it's a wonderful set of variations on this simple theme. But if you come in at any one point, it seems anything but simple. It's a theme in binary form. It has a first half. It has a second half. In a standard way, the second half is longer than the first half. The first half is 8 bars. The second half is 16. But the extraordinary thing is that instead of simply having a repeat, which you would expect, Mozart does repeat each of the halves, but he varies them. First, quite subtly, with some reharmonizations and a little bit of syncopation, and increasingly, quite strikingly, really quite strikingly. So what we're going to do is sort of go through these variations. We won't hear all the wonderful B themes, because that'll take us too long, but we will go through the A theme. So here's the A theme again. And then when we repeat that, notice the very, subtle variations you get, especially in the cello and the viola. And then when you hear the entire movement, the same exact thing happens with the B section, except for it's on a broader scale, 16 bars. And so this is really where you can start to get lost, actually, because you can lose exactly where you are as this movement progresses with that extraordinary B repetition. Variation 1, then, first doesn't seem all that terribly different. You can very much see the outline of the theme. It's when it is repeated, that's when we get to the sort of first radical step. So let's have the first variation. Well, perhaps. This will now begin the radical reinterpretation. What I'd like to say about this is oftentimes in these variation sets, not always, but oftentimes you sort of get a gradual building. We start here, and we gradually move farther and farther and farther away. And that certainly does happen here. But this repeat is actually a radical restatement. There isn't anything that really builds up to it. We suddenly get something quite different.
Should we play the beginning of the variation again?
Again, sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry. The next variation takes it even farther. The first part, again, a lovely statement, already itself a variation, but then when we do get the varied repeat, it's actually a canon, which is this
wonderful canon, skipping down to these big trills, big leaps. There's no precedent in the music for this. There's nothing that prepares you for this to happen, this strict canon. Anyway.
Should we go through this time?
Yes, let's just go through. The next variation is minor, B flat minor, which actually returns us to what is the high point in the first movement, a really crucial moment in that movement. So first we get the theme in minor, a really poignant version of the theme, and then we play a sort of contrapuntal musical chairs for the repeat, the initial repeat, where I think it's violin becomes viola, viola becomes cello, and cello becomes violin, which is quite ingenious, really. Mm. And then all that builds to the last variation, which is this, it's really treating it almost as a chorale. It's like having a cantus firmus, but not a chorale like Bach. It's more like Bach Busoni. Really, really virtuosic, dancing around this cantus firmus in the viola. And then you have a coda at the very end, the very, very end, the last few bars, where the folk tune itself returns. Should we just play the major? Go for it. Thank you. Fantastic. It's hard to find words to sort of respond to that. You will thoroughly enjoy that when you hear that later tonight. Now, with the other movements, we're just sort of aware of the time passing quickly, so pick out some major moments of importance. Going back to the first movement, I think actually what I'd like to talk about is the development, because the development is extraordinarily compressed, concentrated writing, some of Mozart's most interesting counterpoint. It's also harmonically almost shocking for Mozart, straight from the very beginning, when you've never heard a G major chord sound so uncanny. Now he's prepared us by highlighting the note G at the beginning of the piece, but nothing quite prepares for hearing, in the context of B flat major, suddenly a bare G major chord restating the opening head motif. And then the second key area is then represented by a theme now in B flat minor, whereas it originally had been in B flat major.
88.
I'd like to point out that that theme is a really written out version of a turn. We heard a turn at the very beginning of the piece, ending the first phrase, and then all the subsequent phrases had these little turns. And turns become more and more thematic throughout the entire work. And that's sort of in the first movement, the most important statement of that. I'd like to go back to the beginning of the development and play through that first 15 bars, 74 to 88, because you get 7 statements of the opening head motif, moving through all these chromatic pitches in a sort of extraordinary way. Notice that the first and last statements are the only duets. The rest of them are single statements. And notice also that each instrument has this turn figure as a sort of virtuosic rising through the octaves, which we have heard already. Alice and Lesley play in a version in the second movement. We get another version of that. This is where Alice had moved from that C-sharp extraordinary to the D we heard earlier. At the very end of the development, we have one of the most wonderful moments in the piece, the retransition back to E-flat, which has this long pedal point on the note D, and the violin scales highlighting Ds over and over and over again, setting what would appear to be a cadence almost on G, as if we're coming back to the beginning of the development, but then it slides down at the last moment, and we come back to E-flat. Very good. I could have talked for the entire hour on this movement. It is an extraordinary movement with wonderful detail, but we will sort of move on to the second movement. And sort of minor detail, but the sort of just highlighting the sort of real grace that you find in the writing. When we have the main theme, which we've already heard, I want to play that again, but this time notice the expanding intervals leaping upwards from fourths to sixths to sevenths, finally to the octave. And then that the first real dissonance is this leap to a G flat in bar 14. And then I'd like to play the second version of the theme in E-flat major from bar 26, because this is notable. To that opening broken chord, a turn figure in the violin is added, and it becomes then a virtuosic hurtling towards A-flat through 3 octaves. can see him playing around with Gs and G flats again in a different context. If we could turn to the end of the movement, this turn figure is kind of wonderful because it sort of becomes a cadenza for each of the players, and everybody has their go. And interestingly, it sort of passes through the different notes. There's a chromatic version, isn't it? It kind of goes chromatically up through each player.
114.
Oh, sorry,
114 or 112?
114?
114.
And then if you could play the very ending, because it's nice because it has several different goes at the main theme. First of all, it's short, it's made into faster notes, diminution, and then it's displaced off the beat to finally land on that high A flat. Maybe that is the heart of the movement. I don't know. Okay, moving swiftly on. The third movement, I don't want to say much about the two minuets because I want to let the sort of these joyous pieces speak for themselves. But there are a couple of interesting things to highlight quickly. Mostly through Mozart's Motivic procedure. If you could play, Lesley, just the first 8 bars, showing the pickup and repeated notes. How Mozart uses this da-da-dum-bum. In the next phrase, those pickups lead to the repeated notes, but then also new slurs. The repeated notes are divided so that we start getting a slurred phrase as well. And then in the next bit, in bar 25, we have a new counterpoint in the violin, but it's derived from those slurs.
Do you want everybody?
Yeah, I think have everybody, but focus on the violin. And now, quite wonderfully, in the next bit from bar 43, those leaps are then reintegrated back into the original motif, but now turned upside down. And this is what we're really talking about when we say going back to the time of J.S. Bach and marrying it to a classical style. You don't listen to that music and think what contrapuntal ingenuity is on display. It's there, but it's just this vigorous, wonderful, constantly changing music. We've been through the fourth movement, so skipping on to the fifth. It's very different to the previous minuet, really quite tuneful at times and almost jokey. The one moment I want to point out is, again, the counterpoint is very compressed. In bars 9 to 16, you will notice that actually he's doing different things with the same kind of motifs we've just heard. So, it derives from the same ideas. The last movement, this big sonata rondo, wonderful tune to begin with. What's interesting is how it sort of defies expectations. A theme, a repeated note theme that originally appears just to be a sort of transitional theme, turns into being one of the most influential themes in the movement. So perhaps we could restate the main theme, just play the opening, and then we'll skip to the repeated note theme in bar 32.
I think we need to do the return, actually. Let's go from 25.
Okay.
Excellent. And then the one thing I'd like to look at to finish with is the sort of developmental area of this movement, in which the viola starts with a wonderful statement of the A flat of the theme, but it's in A flat, and then we start having a contrapuntal development of that main theme, in which eventually we land in C minor, and we have this passage hovering between G and F sharp again, the sort of special notes that began the entire piece.
Where should we go to? 165? Do you want to go all the way through?
Maybe go 118 to 178.
178. 118.
Sorry. I was in the wrong bar. I've got it now.
Viola players.
Mozart played viola in the first performance.
Indeed.
But he probably didn't start in the wrong bar there. Anyway.
And maybe just to finish, we can have the very, very end just one more time to sort of to round it off. Maybe from 283.
You don't want 272.
Should we do 270? Let's go from 272.
Yeah, it's quite fun.
Very good. So hopefully that'll help you a little bit to acquaint yourself with this wonderful work, and do tune in again later this evening at 7:30. Pass over to Dave.
7:30, yes. Thank you very much, Jamie. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Delight.
I often find that we learn so much from these sessions ourselves, but the concert's so soon we haven't got time to incorporate it, but we'll be thinking along those lines anyway. So yeah, the concert is at 7:30 tonight, live from here. We start with Scott Dickinson, recording from Scott Dickinson from his home with Susan Frank. Fantastic arrangement for viola and piano of another string trio, Beethoven string trio, Opus 8, that was arranged at the time, but we'll tell you about that later. And then we're doing Schulhoff duet, Alice and I. And then we're going to finish with this masterpiece. So we hope to see you there. Thank you very much.